Bristol Bay is predicated on its subsistence culture. The most important salmon you could get is the one that you're putting on your plate. And salmon has sustained our people for thousands of years here in Bristol Bay. The canneries came in 150 years ago. My great-great-great-grandfather was part owner of the first cannery built in Bristol Bay. Clark's Point's named after my grandpa. My father came over here right after World War II and fished out of Clark's Point in a sailboat. And his first few years were a sailboat, and then they allowed engine boats to be used, passed the law. My father couldn't believe how local natives were treated versus the outside white people. There was limits on the natives that were half of the fish limits of the white people. So if there was a 10,000 pound fish limit for a white guy from Seattle, the local natives got 5,000. Local natives couldn't own new nets. They got the hand-me-down nets from the outside fishermen. And the canneries controlled everything. You didn't have a say-so. My father led the charge on getting natives treated more fairly by the fishing community. In fact, one year, the canneries blackballed my father and wouldn't take his fish. So he left here in Nushagak and went to Naknek to fish, because there was a lot of people fishing in Naknek, and they got a boatload of fish and nobody would take his fish, and he was in the mouth of the Naknek River pewing the fish over when the Papetti family, they seen my dad and they thought he had engine trouble, and Dad said, no, I'm being blackballed. And so they went to their cannery superintendent and demanded that they take my dad's fish, otherwise they were going to quit that cannery. All the Papettis were going to quit that cannery, so my dad got a market that year.
My grandma always told me that we were rich. We were rich. I used to say, Grandma, how can you say we're rich? She thought this was the richest place in the world because of the fish, the seal, the berries. But if you stop and you look and you listen, oh, there's hardly any life here. There's no occasional bird. And then the herring come in, and that place just buzzes with life. All of a sudden you see all of this walrus, and the seals, and the sea lions, and the birds, and the seagulls. They all follow. I mean, there's a cycle of life out there that just happens, and it just goes around and round, and every year, you know, it just happens. And that's the good and unique thing I think about Bristol Bay. There's this cycle of life that we need to protect.
The fishery is the economic engine of Bristol Bay. It always will be, not only economically, but culturally, the fishery will be. The fishery provides thousands of jobs, many, many millions of pounds of protein for the world. And along with that, it provides a lot of subsistence food for not only people, but everything else. The forest needs the fish, the bears need the fish, everything, birds, it's a very important link in the ecosystem. We spend a lot of time trying to protect the headwaters of the Bristol Bay region and recognizing that to keep our cultural values healthy, we have to take care of our natural resources. You know, I hope that we could protect the Bering Sea.
The story about protecting the Southeast Bering Sea and Bristol Bay started in 1974, when the U.S. Department of the Interior first began to study the possibility of offshore oil and gas leasing in the region. In the early years, Governor Jay Hammond succeeded twice in persuading the federal government not to lease in Bristol Bay because of the high fishery values and the overall sensitivity of the region. But in 1982, Interior Secretary James Watt created the famous oil and gas leasing program, in which nearly the entire U.S. outer continental shelf was proposed for offshore drilling. This enraged communities from New England to Alaska, because it was a sweeping policy that didn't account for fishing livelihoods, the interests of communities, or ecological sensitivities. the Interior Department scheduled lease sale 92 in the North Aleutian Basin. It was proposed to be 32 million acres. By then, Governor Sheffield was at the state's helm.
The fishermen, you know, not only from Alaska, but from Seattle as well, and all the fishermen groups and the communities, you know, and the people of Alaska were in favor of what we were doing, stopping it. There was sometimes the people of power raise up and exercise their rights, and somebody listens. And
I was in the legislature from 1982 to 1989, and I wrote a letter that said, you know, I'm opposed to this, and so are the people. In response to the argument that there is a national interest to be served by hydrocarbon development in Bristol Bay, I must insist that there are far more important national and international values involved which justify protecting the fisheries of this region.
I remember when Secretary Hodel came to Alaska. We flew out to Bristol Bay where we're going to have a hearing before the fishermen. And it looked like thousands of people outside this building when we drove up, and everybody in the audience was orderly. And I wouldn't expect it to be orderly at all. And in an area that is so prosperous in the numbers of fish and whales coming up and back, everything migrating. The king salmon, all of the products that come out of the sea, including Bristol Bay, the herring every year, and king crab, the red king crab, and you know, just to throw away billions of dollars in a way of life for the people. It all was laid out on the table, and we had a lot to talk about. And he got an earful. At the end of 1985, in December, I brought suit against the Department of the Interior on the Bristol Bay issue, because the sale 92 was supposed to start in January of the next year, right away.
The state of Alaska, Alaska Legal Services representing tribes, and Trustees for Alaska representing conservation groups all took to the court to stop lease sale 92. The district court then combined the cases and those claims that offshore drilling would harm subsistence, harm commercial fisheries, and harm the ecosystem. In the course of the litigation, the sale was reduced from 32 million acres to 5.6 million acres, concentrated north of the Alaska Peninsula. But that really didn't alleviate most concerns that people had. There were several stages in which the court allowed the sale to halt, at least temporarily, but in the end, the court ruled that the sale could go forward. In October 1988, people filed into the Egan Center in Anchorage to watch the government open the oil company bids.
It really hit me right there in the heart. It was devastating to me that my livelihood was worthless to the federal government. My livelihood, my way of life was worthless to the oil companies, and they were pushing their own agenda. It was pretty sad, I tell you.
By this time, Governor Steve Cooper was in office and inherited the job of resolving the lease sale controversy.
At that point in time, in 1988, we had to come back and ask the Congress to put off any decision by the Interior Department in terms of opening up Bristol Bay. And so it seems to me I wrote a letter asking to delay indefinitely the decision on Bristol Bay.
Governor Cooper's letter to the U.S. House Committee on Appropriations noted a number of scientific questions that needed answers, and it highlighted the lack of oil spill response capability for Bristol Bay. A month after he sent that letter to Congress, something terrible happened, and everything changed.
I will never forget the reports that I saw on TV. You know, when I watched those fishermen crying on TV about the loss of their fish, you know, it just broke my heart, because I know that could have been me, you know, out here in the Bristol Bay area, North Aleutian Basin area. I was able to actually go down into Cordova a few years ago and talk to some of the fishermen, talk to some of the people that made the headlines, and it was more devastating than what the TV was describing. When you start talking to people about how it affected their personal lives, it was very devastating. I mean, there was people that committed suicide, marriages that were broken up, disputes, domestic violence. All of the social issues seem to have been increased and impacted that community by that disaster, which you don't see, what you can't see on TV, you know. But when you start talking to an individual down in that community about what happened to them, and I know even to this day, for instance, their herring has never come back, you know, in full strength.
You see what happens when there is no fishery. You see what happens to people, and you see that thread of the fabric of, you know, the social fabric of that area just kind of be torn apart, you know. So it really, you know, it really does matter to the region and to the state what happens in the fishery.
The volume of the spill was officially reported at 11 million gallons. After the oil spread, the damage was done, and the success of various cleanup efforts was limited at best. During the following years, the fishermen struggled to find justice. The Secretary of the Interior at that time was Bruce Babbitt.
I saw firsthand what happened in Prince William Sound. I was up there in 1993. The fishermen, after the disaster, had blockaded the tankers at the Narrows in Prince William Sound. And I showed up and we had a negotiation session, and the fishermen lifted the blockade. But they've never been fully compensated. They've never had the kind of redress that they deserved as a function of the damage that was caused. So as a result of all of the fallout from Exxon Valdez, it wasn't a big reach to say to President Clinton, you now have the power to cancel the leasing program that was put together under the Reagan administration. And he responded very quickly. I mean, this wasn't a hard decision when you looked at the chaos and the tragedy in Prince William Sound to say, we can't, on our watch, let that happen in Bristol Bay.
Well, there was some clear tension between two opposing forces. One, the overriding feeling among Alaskans, certainly, that Bristol Bay needed to be protected. And the other force was that oil companies had paid multi-millions of dollars to lease this land, but were not allowed by Congress to pursue the development of those leases. So something had to happen. And as governor, I wanted to make sure what happened was the fact that these were removed that these leases were permanently removed, rather than just going from a year-to-year moratorium. And at the same time, there was a sense of fairness to the oil companies that they had paid multi-million dollars for leases in fairly done, and if they weren't allowed to develop it, they should at least get paid back for it.
Really, it was a coalition of organizations, and I think several dozen regional organizations, tribes, individuals, but also fishing companies were involved in the Bristol Bay Buyback Coalition, which was an effort housed within Bering Sea Fishermen's Association to work on the buyback of the oil leases.
You know, just right off our shores is the halibut nursery grounds. And that's where the halibut come and spawn their young halibut. Right off our shores and within Bristol Bay watershed is the crab nursery grounds. And king crab and tanner crab and all them crabs, they come up here, and because the substrate on the bottom is so great for their spawning habitat, that's where they release their eggs and raise their young. Our migration of salmon that go out and the salmon that come in is right in the path of where oil and gas is proposed to be developed. And you know, we start messing with the bottom of the ocean and we get oil and gas development, it has the potential to really hurt a number of things.
Even though this was seemingly region specific to Bristol Bay, we knew that the impacts for oil and gas drilling in the bay would affect all species of salmon, groundfish, crab, you name it. And so the organization took on what might seem to some people like a region-specific issue, but this is an Alaska-wide issue. It's not just Bristol Bay.
The value of fisheries in Bristol Bay and the southeast Bering Sea that could potentially be affected by impacts from offshore drilling is extremely high. In 2012, the combined wholesale value of salmon, halibut, herring, crab, and groundfish catch was $2.9 billion. This is the epicenter for over 40% of the entire U.S. domestic wild seafood production, and Bristol Bay earns global significance as the largest wild salmon run in the world.
The coalition was everything from tribes and native villages, native corporations who saw Bristol Bay not just as a commercial fishery, but also as a source of culture, subsistence, spirituality, nutrition, all of the important things of the value of the Bristol Bay salmon run and the whole ecosystem that it engendered. So that was the first and major part of it. Certainly the commercial fishermen were right there.
And when the Exxon Valdez ran aground and spilled the oil, it became the issue of the day. It exploded into the policy-setting world and the world of politics, and we wound up realizing a wake-up call that these issues were very important to fishermen. It galvanized the leadership in Bristol Bay to really take a hard look at this and do what was necessary to protect what we have here.
It was the fishermen who really did the buyback and really worked hard on the buyback. So it was still my dad's generation, but you had the Robin Samuelson and Tom Tilden in our region who were in the tribal council too, that really became the vocal, along with Harvey and my dad and Joe Clark. They all, and Jeff Muck and Mike Davis, you know, that generation really worked hard to make sure the buyback happened.
Thanks to the administration, Secretary Babbitt and President Clinton, Congress, and the state legislature, Alaskans all across the board, we were able to prevail in getting a buyback of those leases and to put it on a more permanent basis to save Bristol Bay.
I don't know whether it was a blessing in disguise or what, but when that Exxon Valdez, went down and they stopped everything and they bought back the leases, then I felt that sorrow for them. And at the same time, I was happy because the government was finally saying that, okay, let's reevaluate everything. And this is what a way to win. This is not the way I wanted to win.
After the buyback was accomplished in 1995, President Clinton reinforced the protection for Bristol Bay through an executive order, withdrawing Bristol Bay from leasing until 2012. And Congress maintained the annual moratorium on sensitive areas around the country, including Bristol Bay. But in 2007, all bets were off. With President Bush in the White House and a new Congress, all protections for Bristol Bay were lifted, and the Interior Department formed a new leasing program that scheduled another lease sale in the exact same area that had been bought back a few years earlier.
And I thought that would never, never, ever happen. But it did. It happened. And I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. You talk about the timing and how this whole thing was just pushed through so quick. that all of a sudden everything got reversed and we were vulnerable again.
I'm a lifelong resident of Bristol Bay. Grew up commercial fishing and subsistence fishing. But throughout most of my life, I never knew of the potential threat of offshore oil and gas development within the area. And that's due to the elders and the ones before me that worked on the issue that led to a congressional moratorium for over 13 years. So, you know, I applaud their efforts, and once I heard it came back up for lease sales, I was astonished.
Although there were promises for jobs and economic diversity, the prevailing opinion from most people was that offshore drilling in Bristol Bay was really not worth the risk. So community, seafood industry, and conservation leaders went to Washington, D.C. to request of President Obama's administration that they protect Bristol Bay once again. Then the new Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, came to Alaska for public hearings both in Dillingham and Anchorage.
Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar.
We cannot let what happened in Prince William Sound happen anywhere else in America or any else place in the world. We have got to withdraw that from the lease sale, period.
By this time, people had really gotten involved in other things. The possibility of large-scale mining in the Bristol Bay headwaters had emerged, and most groups were very focused on protecting Bristol Bay from the proposed pebble mine.
One of the interesting parts about the mining, the large-scale mining, the pebble issue as we know it, and the oil drilling issue is how they came together almost coincidentally in the timing frame. And so somebody might say, oh boy, that's an overload. But maybe it's best that we deal with the same issues at the same time when we're totally focused on the basic fundamental parameters of how you make these decisions and why they would be detrimental to fishermen and salmon. And so in a way, I almost see it as a benefit that everybody is focused on the environment, the habitat, the fish.
Salmon go out into the Pacific Ocean, they come back, and of course people from around the region not only use them to put food in the freezer and smoke them, and they taste really delicious, but then we have harvesters who they sell to a fish company, and they're fishermen. And so you protect them offshore as they are returning into the bays, but then you have to protect them in the headwaters. So extractive industries is mineral, it's pebble, and it's offshore oil and gas development. Those are two very passionate, long-standing fights that our region has had in Bristol Bay to protect from these extractive industries that causes destruction.
The intrinsic values of Bristol Bay and the close relationship between the uplands where salmon spawn and their eggs and little bits of fries are reared. The relationship between that and the ocean environment is so close that it's hard to consider one without considering the other.
The reason why we have 43 million salmon returning this year is because of our habitat. It isn't because of a gold mine. It isn't because of offshore oil and gas. It's because our habitat is so pristine.
The pebble mine threat from the freshwater side raised the same coalition together that had protected the saltwater side with the ocean.
In March 2010, after giving consideration to the concerns that people had raised, President Obama and his administration agreed to remove Bristol Bay from the oil and gas leasing program and to withdraw further consideration until this time, 2017.
Bristol Bay is one of the iconic places of America that should in fact be protected and protected forever.
When President Obama put that moratorium in place and said, this is because Bristol Bay is a national treasure, he was exactly right. It is a national treasure.
I know it's under presidential withdrawal right now, but we should try to seek permanent protection for it.
We want a more permanent way to protect the Bristol Bay region. And whatever shape that takes, it's going to be better than just withdrawing it for another 5 years, let's say. 5 years goes by in a blink of an eye, and it's just too much bait out there for large corporations.
So after speaking with several tribes, we've led to resolutions from tribal governments and Alaska Native organizations, which I found amazing, to work on such a pressing issue that feels like it's threatening their way of life, our way of life.
Regional corporations and regional groups, Bering Sea Fishermen's Association again took to the streets of Washington, D.C. to remind them of the importance of this issue, that it hasn't taken a backseat to other issues of the day, which I think there was concern about, and that the position still stood very firm against oil and gas drilling in Bristol Bay.
A lot of work we've done in the last 10 years has paid off. The fillet lines are going full speed, and everybody's getting paid a price and catching fish, and we protect the fish, and we got fish.
All I could do is just keep on fighting and insisting that we get permanent protection.
I've brought 7th and 8th graders back to Washington, D.C. to testify. And that to me is an important part of protecting the future. And I would expect them, when they are in their 30s and 50s, to do the very same thing. Families in this region, they practice subsistence. Even though they're commercial fishermen, they still practice subsistence. It's cross-generational, so grandpas are teaching their grandsons, and so to me, that cross-generational piece, that information sharing, is just going to make us stronger, and it'll give them the resolve to say, we've learned from my grandpa or my grandma, and what's important to this region is to make sure that those reoccurring resources that we value from subsistence is always going to be there.
Our younger people, even kids in grade school, they march when it's 20 below. They carry signs here in town in 20 below weather. I've seen them against Pebble and against offshore oil and gas. So we've embedded it into our offsprings, and I'm real encouraged by watching these young people, unheard of stuff, and they are really adamant, and this younger generation, and I know that if I died tomorrow, that them young people would step right up to the plate, and they're stepping up to the plate, both in the Pebble and the offshore oil and gas, and they're going to continue to fight on. The Harvey Samuelson is dead, the Robin Samuelson may be dead, the Joe Clark may be dead, but our younger folks are going to be there, and they're going to be probably stronger than we were.
Harvey Samuelson, you know, God rest his soul, was one of the leaders that worried about the Bering Sea, and
he worked right up until the very end. In fact, even when I brought him to the hospital, as he was dying, he was giving me orders what I needed to do and whatnot. And but he worked his full life to make the betterment of the fisheries and better economy here in Bristol Bay. We want some resolve. We want some assurances that our future is going to be intact in a pristine Bristol Bay, that we're going to have our salmon runs to Bristol Bay, that we're going to keep our clean water to Bristol Bay. I think this nation owes Bristol Bay an answer on offshore oil and gas.
Earlier today, I took action to make sure that one of America's greatest natural resources and a massive economic engine, not only for Alaska but for America, Bristol Bay, is preserved for future generations. Bristol Bay has supported Native Americans in the Alaska region for centuries. It supports about $2 billion in the commercial fishing industry, supplies America with 40% of its wild-caught seafood. It is a beautiful natural wonder, and it's something that's too precious for us to just be putting out to the highest bidder. Because of the great work that was done by local communities, Native Alaskans, folks who cared about making sure that we preserve this natural wonder for generations to come, we were able to take action that is going to take it off the bidder's block and make sure that it is preserved into the future. Under the authority granted to me in Section 12A of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, 43 U.S.C. 1341A, this withdrawal prevents consideration of this area for any oil or gas leasing for purposes of exploration, development, or production.